Ancient scrolls that were buried in volcanic ash during the eruption of Mount Vesuvius are now being deciphered 2,000 years later, thanks in part to artificial intelligence.
Ancient Rome has always held stories that the world may never fully know. For centuries, scholars have chased fragments of this lost world, hoping for a glimpse of what truly happened. Now, the revealed X-ray scans of the Charred Herculaneum scroll are stirring centuries-old mysteries, hinting at a hidden world of Roman knowledge and stories that have remained silent for nearly 2,000 years. What they found could change everything we know about ancient Rome. The moment the scrolls spoke again. For nearly 2,000 years, the Herculaneum scrolls were considered nothing more than carbonized relics, blackened, fragile cylinders that crumbled to dust at the slightest touch. These papyrus scrolls, nearly 1,800 ancient books written on plant fiber, had been flash-seared by volcanic heat when Mount Vesuvius erupted in AD 79, engulfing the coastal towns of Herculaneum and Pompeii in superheated ash. Buried beneath layers of hardened rock and pumice, the scrolls rested inside what would later be identified as the Villa of the Papyri, the only surviving intact library from the ancient world. For centuries, scholars despaired at the sight of them. They were charred fossils of thought, impossible to open without complete destruction. Every attempt at unrolling, even with the most careful mechanical methods, ended with the papyrus disintegrating in seconds. Entire libraries were lost forever, their secrets sealed by time and heat. The ancient world's philosophies, letters, and histories seemed permanently silenced by the catastrophe. Then, inside a sealed laboratory at Oxfordshire's Diamond Light Source, a team of researchers attempted something that had never been done before. On a sterile metal platform sat a charred black cylinder, no larger than a wine bottle, coded simply as P-Herc 172. This was one of the scrolls excavated from the Villa of the Papyri, thought to be unreadable. Around it, scientists stood silent as they prepared to expose it to light stronger than sunlight, a beam capable of piercing atoms. For the first time, it would not be human hands that unrolled the scroll, but photons. The team adjusted the X-ray scans, hoping to detect even the faintest trace of writing. At first, the monitors displayed only static, gray bands representing flattened papyrus layers compressed by centuries of pressure. Nothing recognizable appeared. The researchers feared the scroll was too damaged, too uniform to reveal anything meaningful. But then, as they modified the phase contrast settings, the gray patterns began to shift. Out of the noise, faint shadows began to take shape. Letters in ancient Greek, delicate and trembling like ghosts, emerging from smoke. Dr. Michael McCosker of University College London, one of the few experts capable of identifying such markings, immediately recognized what was happening. It was the first time ink had become visible inside a scroll without it ever being unrolled. The discovery was revolutionary. For 2,000 years, experts had assumed that reading these artifacts required contrast, dark ink, against light papyrus.
A 2,000-year-old scroll from the Roman town of Herculaneum has been digitally unwrapped.
But the fire that consumed the villa had made that impossible. Everything was the same shade of black. What the Oxford team realized was that contrast was not the key. Texture was. The ink had not vanished. It had simply risen microscopically above the papyrus surface, forming three-dimensional ridges that could only be detected by phase contrast X-ray tomography. The scientists were not reading color, they were reading height, measuring atomic differences between carbon layers. That subtle revelation changed everything. The scrolls, once thought destroyed, had preserved their text in a hidden dimension invisible to the human eye. The ancient scribes, unknowingly, had written in a way that made their words survive the fire. By creating text elevated in carbon, readable only by technology that would not exist for 2 millennia. The first legible words that appeared, symbols of fear, disgust, and life, sent a chill through the room. They weren't mathematical formulas or government decrees. They were philosophical reflections. The letters were alive with meaning, forming emotional language that seemed personal, even confessional. It was as if someone from the 1st century BCE had reached across time to whisper thoughts preserved by disaster itself. What made this even more extraordinary was the ink itself. Researchers discovered it contained traces of metal, unusual for papyrus manuscripts. This metallic ink improved the clarity of the scan, helping the letters stand out more distinctly than in typical carbon-based inks. The fact that the text could be detected so clearly meant that the ancient author, unknowingly or intentionally, had created a manuscript uniquely suited for rediscovery in the digital age. Each flicker of a Greek character confirmed the impossible. The words of antiquity were not lost, only waiting for the right kind of light to see them. And within those first illuminated letters, the boundaries between science and history blurred completely. The burned pages had not perished. They had transformed into a carbon archive of consciousness, sealed until humanity learned how to listen. This was more than technological success. It was an archaeological resurrection. The beam of light passing through P. Herc 172 connected modern science with an ancient mind frozen in carbon. For the first time, the boundaries between destruction and preservation blurred, and what was once dismissed as dust began whispering Rome's forgotten philosophies. If one blackened cylinder could reveal a voice from antiquity, what other memories lie waiting beneath the ashes of time? Stay with us to know. The hidden code inside the ash. The more the researchers studied the Charred Herculaneum scroll, the clearer it became that what they had found was not a simple fragment of ancient writing, but a carefully constructed artifact of meaning. Inside the blackened cylinder known as P. Herc 172, they identified patterns of ink elevation, spacing, and rhythm, indications of a deliberate structure buried within the ash. When phase contrast X-rays revealed the first recognizable letters, the text didn't resemble the technical records or administrative documents historians had expected. It was written in ancient Greek, its words emotional and unguarded: disgust, fear, pleasure. These were not the detached observations of a bureaucrat. They were the emotional vocabulary of a philosopher. The writing's form and flow led scholars to a single possible author, Philodemus, the Epicurean philosopher active in the 1st century BCE, known to have resided at the villa of the papyri under the patronage of Lucius Calpurnius Piso. Philodemus wrote about the nature of vice, virtue, and the balance of human desire. His teachings were grounded in Epicureanism, a school that viewed pleasure as the goal of life, not hedonistic excess, but tranquility born of reason. Yet the tone of this recovered text was darker, more introspective. The words read like an anatomy of human emotion under siege, as if written in the shadow of an empire losing its moral footing. The recurring terms, bios, phobos, hedon, formed a triad of existence. Their repetition across the scroll's layers suggested that the author was not simply writing philosophy, but measuring the pulse of human experience. As the scans deepened, an unexpected pattern emerged. Beneath the visible letters were secondary alignments, faint impressions that didn't correspond to ordinary writing. They hinted at layered construction, a kind of encoded layout invisible to the naked eye. When the data was processed through AI-enhanced tomography, it revealed slight but consistent irregularities in spacing and curvature, too deliberate to be accidental. These micro-patterns implied intent. The philosopher's handwriting carried embedded cues, perhaps a concealed framework of meaning. Scholars began to suspect that the scroll contained more than ideas. It held a coded moral system, structured for interpretation beyond its own age. What appeared as poetry or reflection might have been arranged with mathematical precision to preserve hierarchy, emphasis, and progression. Even the ink composition seemed purposeful. Unlike typical carbon-based inks, this one carried traces of metallic elements, giving it a distinctive X-ray signature. That subtle difference made the words more visible in scans, almost as if they were designed to endure. Whether intentional or accidental, the material itself aided its resurrection. turning Philodemus's philosophy into a literal survivor of fire.
The document was badly burnt by the volcanic eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD.
To historians, the discovery transformed the nature of classical study. For the first time, they weren't just reading a philosopher, they were watching the architecture of his thought, rendered in microscopic geometry. The phase contrast tomography exposed not only what he wrote, but how he structured his reflections on fear and desire. The emotional became technical, the moral became measurable. This revelation suggested something extraordinary about the Villa of the Papyri. It wasn't simply a wealthy man's library, but an intentional archive of the Republic's fading conscience. Its authors were documenting decay from within, encoding philosophy in ways that could survive not through memory, but through matter. The scroll was more than words scorched into papyrus. It was philosophy preserved in the physics of survival. Each raised line, each metallic glimmer, held fragments of human feeling encrypted by disaster. In the quiet between data scans, it was easy to imagine that Philodemus had found a way to speak across time and chose to whisper through ash. If emotion could be preserved as code, let's see what would happen when machines began decoding the history behind it. The Vesuvius Challenge, teaching machines to see through time. While Oxford scientists worked to expose Philodemus's hidden philosophy, a parallel revolution was unfolding thousands of miles away, not in excavation trenches, but in computer labs. The effort to read the Herculaneum scrolls had become a digital race against time, known as the Vesuvius Challenge. Launched in 2023, this global initiative united archaeologists, programmers, and AI researchers in a common goal: to extract complete text from the carbonized papyri without ever unrolling them. The challenge represented the merging of classical scholarship and data science, where ancient ink met neural networks. At the center of it all was Dr. Brent Seals from the University of Kentucky.
Are going to reconnect with a part of our history that's incredibly difficult to connect to.
For over a decade, Seals had been pioneering virtual unwrapping technology, teaching computers to reconstruct scrolls layer by layer from phase, contrast, X-ray scans. His vision was both poetic and scientific: to teach machines to see through time. The problem was immense. Each scroll contained billions of microscopic variations in carbon density, indistinguishable to the human eye. To a computer, it looked like noise, chaotic, repetitive, unreadable. But Seals believed the patterns were not random. Using advanced machine learning algorithms, his team trained AI models to detect subtle anomalies, tiny fluctuations in pixel intensity that betrayed the presence of ink. Participants in the Vesuvius Challenge received open-source datasets, vast digital reconstructions of unopened scrolls. Their task was to locate the hidden writing inside the digital fog. The stakes were high. A $700,000 grand prize awaited whoever could uncover continuous, readable Greek text. In late 2024, the breakthrough came not from veteran scholars, but from 3 students scattered across continents. They designed a deep learning architecture capable of distinguishing the minute textural contrast between papyrus fibers and ink ridges. Within weeks, their algorithm identified over 2,000 Greek letters from one scroll, the first complete sentences ever read without physical contact. The result sent shockwaves through the academic world. Words that had been silent for 2 millennia now reappeared with clarity, their meaning unmistakable. Among the recovered vocabulary were the same terms seen in the Oxford scans: bios, phobos, hedon, confirming that multiple scrolls shared a single thematic lineage. These were not isolated texts. They were interconnected reflections on human nature, copied and preserved intentionally. What fascinated researchers wasn't just the recovery of language, but the implications of pattern recognition. As the AI mapped more fragments, it began finding consistency in spacing, rhythm, and sequence, suggesting the scrolls were compiled to mirror both philosophical and historical progression. Each dataset uncovered another layer of design, a kind of ancient editorial order visible only through computation. This transformation redefined archaeology itself. The Vesuvius challenge proved that the study of antiquity no longer belonged solely to the historian's eye. It now relied on algorithms capable of detecting meaning beyond human perception. The project turned machines into translators of lost civilizations, retrieving not only letters, but intentions. Historians compared the process to resurrecting thought from the dead. As the digital reconstructions advanced, they began to expose a coherent structure connecting Philodemus's philosophy to other yet unread scrolls that appeared to discuss politics, warfare, and collapse. The AI didn't just read, it correlated, revealing a hidden network of texts written to preserve Rome's moral and historical self-portrait. Every scan blurred the line between discovery and resurrection. The algorithms were not just decoding ink, they were reviving the minds that made it. Each fragment restored was a heartbeat from antiquity, each dataset a bridge through time. In the glow of the monitors, machines became the archaeologists of memory, bringing the buried conscience of Rome to light. If machines could resurrect language from fire, what else might they awaken that humanity chose to forget? The philosopher in the ash. The moment the name appeared on the reconstructed image, the researchers froze. Among the faint Greek letters, blurred by static and carbon dust, one word stood out clearly: Philodemus. It was a discovery as staggering as it was intimate, a voice resurrected from 2,000 years of silence. The X-ray reconstructions confirmed what the experts had begun to suspect. The mysterious text extracted from the Charred Herculaneum scroll was not anonymous philosophy. It was authored by one of antiquity's most elusive thinkers, a poet and philosopher who lived and taught during the 1st century BCE. He was a follower of Epicurus, but his approach to ethics diverged sharply from the simple pursuit of pleasure. To Philodemus, pleasure was a fragile equilibrium, easily poisoned by ambition, greed, and moral decay. The scroll, identified through AI-assisted imaging, matched the opening volume of his 10-part work titled On Vices. The text dissected human flaws, greed, arrogance, flattery, and disgust, not as sins to be condemned, but as distortions of human nature. He wrote that moral failure stemmed from imbalance, from emotions unchecked by reason. His work wasn't a sermon. It was an analysis of the psyche, centuries ahead of what modern thinkers would later call psychology. But the tone that emerged from the recovered passages disturbed the team. These weren't the words of a man writing for approval or posterity. The voice in the text felt aware of its own mortality, almost prophetic. Dr. Michael McCosker described the tone as eerily final, like an author who knew the civilization around him was beginning to crack. His reflections on fear and desire no longer read as abstract musings. They read like warnings written from within a dying world. That sense of urgency began to take shape when historians considered where these scrolls had been found. In the villa of the papyri, the opulent seaside residence of Lucius Calpurnius Piso, father-in-law of Julius Caesar. Piso had been a powerful statesman and patron of literature, known for surrounding himself with intellectuals and poets. Philodemus was not only among them, he was his private tutor and confidant. The philosopher's proximity to Rome's ruling elite explained both his insight and his caution. Writing too openly about moral corruption during that era could invite ruin. The connection raised profound questions. Why were these moral treatises preserved in Piso's private library, alongside works of politics and rhetoric? Why were they hidden rather than displayed? The placement seemed deliberate, as if Piso and Philodemus understood that their discussions of vice and virtue were politically explosive. Their words described not only human weakness, but the ethical decline of the Republic itself. Scholars examining the digital reconstructions began to see the scroll's structure as intentional. The progression of themes mirrored the Republic's descent, from moderation to excess, from confidence to paranoia. Every paragraph seemed to map a step in Rome's moral deterioration. His philosophy was not abstract reflection, it was diagnosis. Every recovered phrase expanded the boundary between philosophy and prophecy. What had once been a forgotten papyrus now read like an ethical post-mortem of the Roman world, authored by a man who saw the collapse approaching and encoded his understanding in words resilient enough to survive fire.
And how AI is helping scientists digitally unwrap this ancient, burnt Roman scroll.
Philodemus's voice feels less like a whisper from the past and more like a mirror held to the present. His reflections on arrogance and indulgence echo through centuries of power and pride. The Herculaneum scroll doesn't just resurrect his philosophy, it exposes his foresight. In the silence of ash, the philosopher's conscience still glows. If Philodemus foresaw the collapse of virtue, what truths would emerge when history's silence began to speak through another man's lost account? The discovery that shouldn't exist. When the next batch of X-ray reconstructions arrived from the Herculaneum project, researchers expected more fragments from Philodemus's ethical works. Instead, they found something that shattered every assumption about what lay hidden inside the Villa of the Papyri. The text that appeared on their screens didn't belong to a philosopher at all. It belonged to a historian. As the AI reconstruction models filtered through the dense carbon data, unfamiliar words began to surface, Latin phrases, not Greek. Among them, one stood out with chilling clarity, bellorum civilium, of the civil wars. The repetition of the term throughout the scan indicated a structured historical narrative rather than philosophical meditation. At first, scholars thought they were looking at an annotation or perhaps a later copy of an unrelated text, but chemical and structural analyses told a different story. The ink composition and script style perfectly matched manuscripts from the late Roman Republic. When the fragments were fully mapped, the team could scarcely believe what they were seeing. The phrases referred to the collapse of the Republic, to battles between generals, and to conspiracies within the Senate. The tone was observational, critical, precise, the work of a witness. And then came the moment that changed everything. Hidden within the reconstructed text appeared a name, Seneca. The revelation shook the academic community. For centuries, historians had believed that the elder Lucius Annaeus Seneca, father of the philosopher Seneca the Younger, had written a monumental history of Rome's internal wars titled Historiae ab initio bellorum civilium, history from the beginning of the civil wars. Every record of that work had been lost. Only a handful of quotations survived in secondary sources. Scholars had accepted that the text was gone forever. Now, nearly 2,000 years later, it had resurfaced, trapped within volcanic ash. The implications were staggering. The scroll unearthed from Piso's villa was not just philosophy preserved by chance. It was the missing chronicle of the Republic's disintegration, authored by a man who had lived through the violence he described. Seneca the Elder had witnessed the conspiracies, betrayals, and power struggles that transformed Rome from a democracy into an empire. His manuscript had vanished from the historical record, not by accident, but, many suspected, by design. Unlike natural loss, which consumes archives over time, this disappearance bore signs of intentional erasure. Political histories could be destroyed as easily as they were written. The rise of the Caesars left little room for competing narratives, especially ones that exposed the Republic's corruption and decay. If Mount Vesuvius hadn't erupted in AD 79, the Villa of the Papyri might have shared that same fate. Its contents purged, its memory rewritten. In this buried vault, philosophy and history now converged. The works of Philodemus had analyzed the inner collapse of morality, while Seneca the Elder chronicled the outer collapse of the state. Together, they painted a twofold portrait of Rome's end, the ethical and the political, preserved side by side beneath layers of ash. The reconstructed passages from Seneca's lost chronicle read like dispatches from within the storm. They spoke of generals, senators, and conspirators, some with names never before recorded in any surviving source. The text offered not legends, but eyewitness accounts of deceit, ambition, and bloodshed. It described the world of Lucius Calpurnius Piso, the very man whose household had harbored Philodemus, a world where moral philosophy and political corruption coexisted under the same roof. For historians, the discovery proved that the Villa of the Papyri was no mere estate. It was a vault of forbidden memory, a deliberate collection of writings meant to preserve what Rome's rulers might have wished to destroy. Its existence implied coordination, intent, and defiance. Piso's library had become a time capsule of truths too dangerous for its own century. The rediscovery of Seneca the Elder's lost history turned the ashes of Herculaneum into Rome's most honest archive. What the fire destroyed, it also protected. Every recovered sentence defied centuries of censorship, each one an echo from a man who dared to write what emperors feared to remember: the truth of a republic collapsing from within. If one lost historian could rise from the ashes, what else might still be buried in that villa? Truths that Rome itself conspired to silence. Let's find out. The villa that watched Rome burn. The Villa of the Papyri stood once on the Bay of Naples, overlooking calm waters that betrayed no hint of the disaster to come. In AD 79, when Mount Vesuvius erupted, the estate vanished beneath a surge of superheated ash and gas that reached nearly 600 degrees Fahrenheit. What it buried was more than marble and mosaics. It sealed an entire library of human thought, turning a home of learning into a tomb of knowledge. When the villa was rediscovered in the 18th century, archaeologists realized it was unlike any site ever found. Nearly 1,800 papyrus scrolls emerged from its blackened halls, all carbonized but astonishingly intact. It was the only complete library from the ancient world to survive into modern times. At first, scholars thought it might be a coincidence that the scrolls had survived purely by chance, but the more researchers studied the manuscripts and their arrangement, the more deliberate it seemed. The estate belonged to Lucius Calpurnius Piso, a statesman and father-in-law of Julius Caesar. Piso's wealth and influence positioned him at the center of the late Republic's most turbulent years. Yet, what defined his villa wasn't its grandeur, but its contents. The scrolls it held were not random acquisitions. They formed a cohesive archive that combined moral philosophy, political history, and personal reflection, a cross-section of the Republic's conscience.
A 2,000-year-old scroll from the Roman town of Herculaneum has been digitally unwrapped.
Inside its private library, works by Philodemus, Piso's philosophical advisor, sat alongside fragments now identified as the lost historical accounts of Seneca the Elder. To archaeologists, this arrangement was extraordinary. Why would a Roman aristocrat preserve both philosophy and history together? The answer seemed to lie in intent. The villa's collection was not ornamental. It was curated, philosophy to explain how Rome fell, and history to show how it happened. This idea transformed the meaning of the site. Piso's villa was not merely a sanctuary of learning, but a repository of defiance. Its scrolls chronicled the moral and political collapse of a republic sliding into tyranny. And when Vesuvius erupted, what it destroyed also became what it preserved. The fire that consumed the villa's inhabitants calcified its scrolls into carbonized relics, locking their words into the black shells that scientists now read through X-ray phase contrast tomography. When AI-assisted scans began reconstructing the villa's layout, researchers found evidence of yet unopened chambers buried beneath volcanic debris. Ground-penetrating radar revealed sealed rooms, potential archives untouched since the day of the eruption. Inside, they believe, lie additional scrolls written by contemporaries of Philodemus and Seneca, perhaps even new works that bridge their philosophical and historical threads.
Entombed in volcanic ash for hundreds of years, these papyrus scrolls were carbonized.
The pattern recognition data collected from existing scrolls also pointed to a network of scribes and copyists working within Piso's patronage. Microscopic variations in ink density and stroke depth revealed the presence of multiple hands, each identifiable through unique pen pressure and curvature. This finding confirmed that the Villa of the Papyri functioned like an organized archive, a workshop of knowledge preservation. Its operation blurred the line between private study and historical documentation. To historians, the Villa of the Papyri became more than an archaeological site. It was the last witness to the Republic's conscience, a structure that had seen its civilization rot from indulgence and ambition, and then held that truth within its walls until humanity learned how to read again. Piso's home had not simply watched Rome burn, it had recorded the smoke. The villa stands as the most haunting paradox in Roman history, destroyed yet immortal. Its walls did not merely witness a civilization's ruin, they preserved its self-examination. Within that sealed labyrinth, Rome left behind not a monument to power, but a confession in carbon. And through the light of modern science, that confession finally speaks. If the Villa of the Papyri preserved the truth of Rome's fall, what hidden design in the ash might reveal how deliberately that truth was protected? When Rome spoke again. For centuries, the voices of Herculaneum had been sealed in silence, their words entombed by Vesuvius, their meaning erased by time. But when modern X-ray scans and AI reconstruction finally brought their messages into view, what emerged was more than ancient text. It was a dialogue across millennia, Rome itself, speaking again through light and code. In one dataset, the recurring term bellorum civilium reappeared, of the civil wars, unmistakably echoing the lost chronicles of Seneca the Elder. In another, philosophical phrases tied to Philodemus's on vices surfaced again. Bios meaning life, phobos meaning fear, hedon meaning pleasure, lipe meaning sorrow, and epithemia meaning desire. The more the algorithms compared them, the clearer the connection became. These scrolls were not isolated writings scattered by accident. They were components of a single intellectual project. The Villa of the Papyri had preserved both moral philosophy and political history as two halves of the same reflection, an archive designed to capture not just Rome's fall, but the why behind it. The discovery confirmed what no historian could prove before. The Villa of the Papyri had functioned as an organized archive of the Republic's collapse. Its authors, Philodemus, Seneca, and others still unnamed, were documenting the moral, emotional, and political dimensions of a world in decline. Philosophy explained the corrosion of virtue. History recorded its consequences. The scrolls revealed how fear, once a natural instinct, became an instrument of control. How pleasure, once the measure of balance, turned into indulgence. How desire, once philosophical, grew into empire. Every term carried both ethical and historical weight. The message was unmistakable. The Republic had not been conquered by enemies. It had been consumed by itself.
Papyrus scrolls from the library of a villa in Herculaneum. All attempts to unroll the delicate and ancient paper have proven destructive.
By 2025, the number of successfully scanned scrolls had reached 18, with dozens more awaiting analysis at the European Synchrotron Radiation Facility. Each new recovery added fragments of thought, moral instruction, eyewitness testimony, and commentary on power. Together, they built the most complete intellectual picture of the late Republic ever assembled. The Herculaneum scrolls no longer whisper, they sing. Every letter extracted from ash is a pulse from a vanished world. Science gave Rome back its memory, and in that recovery lies a warning that knowledge once buried never truly dies. Beneath every ruin sleeps a voice, waiting only for the right light to speak again. Rome has spoken again, not through conquest or glory, but through confession. If fire could preserve truth once, what other buried words are waiting beneath centuries of silence? Share your thoughts in the comments below.